continuing with a brief history of psychology, and previously I talked about pre-scientific psychology and giving the short version of how we got to the point where we were ready to have a true science of psychology. And we generally trace back the beginning of psychology as a science to the year 1879 in Europe, particularly in Germany. There was a laboratory founded by Wilhelm Vunt. Students often want to say Wundt, but my best understanding of German pronunciation is that it would be Wundt. And Wundt, particularly with one of his students, Edward Titchener, were the pioneers in getting psychology, study of mental processes, to use the scientific method. Now, if you remember from previous classes, with the scientific method, you have to propose a hypothesis. You have to create an educated guess, a reasonable prediction that can be refuted or falsified, and you have to conduct a study. You have to conduct an experiment or some other type of study where you make observations, unbiased observations, and you can refute or possibly support your hypothesis. So, those first scientific activities in psychology, did they involve topics that we often think of when we think of psychology today? For most students, the answer would probably be no. They were very much interested in topics that now would fall under the category of sensation and perception. Because remember where we're starting from. Nobody had really studied thinking, so there was a lot of curiosity of just basically, hey, how do we think? You know, when we look at something and perceive a color, for example, how do we know that it is that color? They were not talking about therapy. They were not talking about how to improve schools or creating parenting advice or anything like that. It was not applied. It was more in the realm of what we would call basic research for curiosity's sake. And this was the first time that anyone had attempted to incorporate objectivity. Objectivity, where you take your opinions, your bias, you leave those to the side, and you just focus on what you can observe, what kind of evidence or data you can gather. And so Wundt is considered the father of psychology. If you have any test questions asking about the father of psychology, you should instantly think Wundt. Now, as I mentioned previously, his student Titchener was also very influential, and they are both given credit for starting the first field of thought in psychology that we call structuralism. All right, so Wundt and Titchener are credited with getting structuralism started. Titchener believed experiences could be broken down into individual emotions and sensations. Basically, they were pieces or parts of thinking that we could discover and learn more about. He was inspired by what we consider, the more traditional or hard sciences like physics. In physics, you can take matter and break it down into smaller parts like molecules and atoms. He wanted to do that with mental processes or thinking. And so there was a lot of breaking things down into their basic parts. Titchener is also known for a technique, a laboratory technique known as introspection. Introspection, I like to describe it as thinking about thinking. Asking research participants to describe how they know something, how they perceive something. Basically, describe your thinking to me. This is not the most precise or even the most valid method of learning about thinking, but we had to get started somewhere, and this is where we got started. So participants were trained to look inward and describe their own thought processes. This technique did fall out of favor because of problems with it. You can't truly be objective about your own thinking. You don't necessarily have access to all the steps and parts and pieces that are involved in your own thinking. But again, we had to start somewhere. Now, after Wundt and Titchener got us started, gave us the idea that, hey, you can study mental processes using the scientific method, more joined. more figures joined the field. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about William James, who founded another field, another school of thought in psychology known as functionalism.